Welcome to your third video lecture of chapter 12. In this section, we're going to talk all about the classification of marine organisms. So in the last video, we looked at the classification of life in general, and then we're going to focus on the marine organisms. So marine organisms are classified according to where they live and also how they move. So the organisms that inhabit the water column are classified as plankton. So those are the drifters or floaters. Nekton, which are the swimmers. And all other organisms are benthos, and those are the bottom dwellers. So for your exam, just know these three types and the description of each. So plankton are the floaters, nekton are swimmers, and benthos are bottom dwellers. Now we're going to kind of look at each one specifically. So plankton are going to include all of the organisms that drift with the ocean currents. If we're talking about just one individual organism, we call it a plankter. When we're talking about them all as a whole, we call them plankton. So many plankters can swim, but only weakly or vertically. So they can't determine their own horizontal position within the ocean. So they just kind of drift around. Plankton are highly abundant and really important in the marine environment. In fact, most of Earth's biomass consists of plankton. So speaking of plankton, there's so many of them and how important they are. We're going to talk about the different types of plankton. And plankton are going to be classified based on their feeding styles. So the first type are autotrophic. So that is if an organism can photosynthesize and produce its own food, then we call them phytoplankton. They're heterotrophic if an organism cannot produce its own food and relies on food purchased by others. Then we call them zooplankton, and this includes drifting marine animals. There are also some other types of plankton. So there's bacterioplankton. These are very small, and they're the most abundant photosynthetic biomass. Then we have vireoplankton, which are even smaller than bacterioplankton, and these are viruses. They're not very well understood, and they actually can help limit the abundance of other plankton through infection. And then we have holoplankton, which live their entire lives as plankton. Continuing on, looking at some other ones. This first one is the one that you need to know for the exam, and that's meroplankton. So those are plankton that spend part of their adult lives as nekton or benthos and spend their juvenile and or larval stages as plankton. So they only spend part of their lives as plankton. Then we have macroplankton, which are large floating animals and algae, and picoplankton, which are the very small floaters. So this is an example of meroplankton. So remember, meroplankton is an organism that spends part of its life as plankton. So example is a squid, where its larvae is in the planktonic stage. And then when it's an adult, it's nectonic. So when it's a little larva, it's planktonic, it just floats and drifts around until it becomes an adult, and then it's able to be nectonic and swim. So that kind of leads us into our next section. We're going to talk about our second classification of marine organisms, and we're going to look at nekton. So nekton include all animals that are capable of moving independently of the ocean currents by swimming or other means of propulsion. So basically the independent swimmers. So nekton includes most adult fish, marine mammals, and marine reptiles. So here's just some examples of nekton: the blue shark, a dolphin, a tuna, squid, and some fish. And our last type of classification of marine organisms looks at benthos. So these are organisms that live on or in the ocean bottom, so these are bottom dwellers. There's actually multiple types of them. So the first type is epifauna, and these are the organisms that live on the surface of the seafloor, and they're attached to the rocks or they move along the bottom. Then we have infauna, and they live buried in the sand in discarded shells or in mud that exists on the sea bottom. And then finally nectobenthos, and these are the ones that swim or crawl through the water above the seafloor. So the benthos are going to be most abundant in shallow water, and a lot of them actually live in darkness, coldness, and stillness. And here's the examples of benthos. So epifauna are the ones that are on the surface, like 1 and 2. Infauna are the ones buried in the sediments, here like 13, 14, and 15. And nectobenthos are the ones that swim or crawl above the seafloor. So examples are the crab and the starfish, so numbers 10 and 12, or 10 and 11, excuse me. So now that we've kind of classified the organisms and broke them down into types, we're going to look at how many marine species there actually are. So the total number of species on Earth, both marine and terrestrial, is 1.8 million, and that number is constantly increasing as we discover new species. But when we're looking at marine species, many of them haven't been identified yet because it's really difficult to explore the deep sea. It's difficult and it's expensive. And the ocean is so big that we haven't seen all of it yet. So there's a lot of species out there that we haven't discovered. So there's been, in recent years, as many as 2,000 new species discovered each year. Now we're looking at land versus marine species. There's more species on land than in the marine environment. And that's because the ocean conditions are more stable than the land environment. So a major factor that actually leads to the creation of different species is the variability of the environment. So the more variable an environment is, the more species are going to be present. And there's less adaptation and speciation required in the ocean because those conditions are more stable. There's actually a program called the Census of Marine Life that seeks to go out and discover new marine species. So it was actually a 10-year program that they completed in 2010, and they discovered at least 1,200 new marine species. And that includes this guy on this slide called the Yeti crab. And they also helped assess diversity, distribution, and the abundance of marine organisms. So this kind of wraps up this section. We looked at how marine organisms are classified, and we also looked at the number of marine species. So make sure you go to the next video to check out how the marine species adapt to the ocean environment.